Hello and welcome to our discussion in Living Wage Week. We're here to talk about pay because pay is something that matters to us all. The real living wage rate was announced today of £9.50 an hour. The real living wage is, of course, not to be confused with the national living wage, which is actually the statutory minimum. It's not only more, but it's voluntary and it applies to people of all ages. We're pleased that in Wales, we've had a growing number of employers accrediting with the Living Wage Foundation to pay the real living wage. And I'm really pleased to be joined by a panel of business and trade union key people to talk about what the living wage might mean for people in Wales today. So, first of all, can I ask Dominic, what's your reaction to today's announcement of the real living wage today? Dominic?
Well, we obviously welcome what in effect is a pay rise for thousands of workers in Wales. And we welcome it because, unlike the national living wage, it's evidence-based. So it's based on what amount you need to have in order to live a decent life and be able to contribute to society. But unfortunately, there are tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of people in Wales who won't benefit from this pay rise. And that includes very significant elements of the public sector. We have got a Welsh Government position on ensuring the living wage is the minimum that is paid in the health service, but we don't have such a commitment in local government. So the lowest pay in local government is £9.25, and certainly for a lot of the essential workers that we were clapping in the first lockdown, they will not be receiving this pay rise because unfortunately a lot of them are either based on local government pay or based on the national minimum wage, or the national living wage as it's called. And so whilst we welcome it, there is a lot to be done to address low pay in Wales, which is a particular problem, but low pay in the essential public services that we all rely on.
Okay, and from a business perspective, Heather, what's your view? What does the real living wage rate mean for your members in the South Wales Chamber?
Yes, thank you. I mean, obviously, the real living wage is a discretionary wage payment that can be made by employers. And I think that a number of employers who do currently pay that will be looking to obviously increase and match their rate of pay to the real living wage. However, it's a really tough time for businesses at the moment. There's a lot of employers looking at ways to simply keep people on the books and keep the lights on at the moment, with the effects in some sectors where traditionally we've perhaps seen less real living wage being paid in the hospitality and the retail sectors. Now they're being hit particularly hard at the moment through the pandemic. They're actually not able to trade for chunks of time. They're back hopefully trading again today, but still not certain how that will impact on their ability to keep trading. So it's a mixed piece, I would say, in terms of the private sector. I think from the businesses that I work with, those that can pay the real living wage really try to do that. Sometimes the choices are not as straightforward as whether it's the right thing to do, it's whether or not they can actually still keep people employed. Okay. And I think keeping people employed is pretty important right now.
Absolutely. Sue, is that your experience with your members in business in the community?
Yeah, and I suppose where we have a sort of a particular view is that our members are self-professed sort of responsible employers, so they're businesses that have put a foot forward to say they want to be leaders in all sorts of areas, particularly around employment. So I think what they've been telling us is that they want to use this awful time, I guess, as an opportunity to come out of it the other side and rethink business models. And, I understand that's not possible in all. And for some industries, as already said, they've been hit harder and actually have got increased costs. So their margins are squeezed more than ever because of the costs of doing business in this situation. But they see this as, at the other side of it, we want to make sure that this doesn't give organisations permission to slip backwards in the progress that we've probably made over the last few years, and that it should be an opportunity to really rethink how you manage your business and how important your staff are to you. And I think we've all had a bit of a window into some of our colleagues' lives and seen, as we say, about the key workers and the impact that this crisis has had on them. So I think the public sentiment is different now as well, and our businesses are realising that people feel differently about those that support us day to day that we might not have had enough thought or respect for in the past.
Thanks. And Nisreen, I mean, I know that Wales TUC has been very closely involved in both the way in which the business closures have affected workers' rates and also, sadly, an increasing number of job losses. What's your reaction to the real living wage rate announced today?
Yeah, I think like Dominic said, it's important to welcome it because it does mean a pay rise for a lot of workers, hopefully, who are working for accredited employers. But you know, we're so conscious that it doesn't reach an awful lot of workers in Wales, particularly those in the sectors that have really suffered throughout this crisis, like hospitality, leisure, and even those sectors like social care, where now the majority of the workforce in Wales is outside the public sector, well, outside direct public sector employment, and therefore not on local government or health terms and conditions, and that much more vulnerable. I think one thing that maybe gets forgotten about a bit as well is the amount of people in illegal employment rates still. So between, I think, 1% and 3% of people working in Wales, which is, you know, tens of thousands of people are paid illegal rates of pay still. So I think the living wage is a really important campaign, a good way to highlight low pay, but it doesn't necessarily give the kind of full picture of what's happening at the poorer end of the labour market in Wales.
Okay, I mean, Sarah, you've seen the number of employers who are accredited with the Living Wage Foundation absolutely rocket. A few years ago, Wales was the real laggard in the numbers. We had, you know, 50, 60, 70 employers, and here we are with 260 something.
Yeah.
Do you want to say, I mean, how is it that we've done so well so far? And do you see that trend going forward in you know, very, very difficult circumstances?
Yeah, so just first of all, I just wanted to really echo some of the concerns that, you know, we're still, although it's been great to see the number of accreditations going up, certainly care is a particular sector we're focused on at the moment, working with Citizens Cymru and the unions and local authorities in particular to try and, you know, promote or secure funding for some of those very low paid sectors. But in terms of the number of accreditations and what's next, I think it's also important to bear in mind that it's not just the case for the living wage isn't just economic, it does also bring other business benefits. Cardiff University do a lot of research for the Living Wage Foundation on the business benefits of accreditation. You know, they, for example, their improved relations between staff and managers, increased commitment and motivation, improved retention and also recruitment of employees. It's also about leadership. Accreditation itself is about showing leadership, the opportunity then to cascade the living wage down supply chains. I think what's important about the accreditation is that it's the commitment to two things. It's the commitment to a longer term investment, so the commitment to uplift annually in line with the living wage rate increase, but also that contractors that work on the premises for, you know, the 2 hours a week for 8 consecutive weeks, so those that form a part of the business are also then uplifted, and employers make that commitment to using, you know, their leverage, I suppose, to uplift those. And some of those contractors are often in low paid sectors such as security, cleaning. So I feel, you know, I think that employers, we have seen a number of employers, even since the start of lockdown, accrediting, and I think that that's because they wanted, for a few reasons, they want to show their workforce that they're investing in them during difficult times. They want to show leadership, but also it forms part of that resilience of an organisation as well. So, yeah.
I mean, Sue, you said earlier that a number of your members were looking at a new business model as they come out of the pandemic. To what extent is the living wage featuring for them?
Yeah, and I think, as Sarah's just said, actually, it's about putting a marker, isn't it? It's about showing leadership. And I think once people have committed to this, it is for the long term. It's not something that you can then sort of row back on. So I think, you know, the feedback we have had from them is that as a group, they're really keen to keep moving forward, and not just with pay. I think the other thing that this has made a lot of businesses think about is the package that they give their staff. So pay is obviously the most obvious thing, but it's all of the surrounding support that they give to their staff. And as I say, we've had this, you know, window into their lives through the fact that we've had video calls with staff that we may never have seen inside their houses before. And I think seeing how they live their lives, and I think businesses are thinking more about actually, you know, what their relationship with their staff needs to be going forward, and pay is a big part of that. I think as well, it's this thing about coming out the other side. Consumers are watching how businesses behave with their employees, and I think even though some have had to downsize, and we all understand why that's been, it's doing that in a responsible manner, and then, you know, looking after those that remain, because I think a lot of us have experienced, if you're working in a smaller organization than before, you know, the job pressure increases as well. So I think it's thinking about not just the pay, but the package around that as well. And I think, as has already been said, the benefits from paying the living wage that, you know, businesses see will help them to be more resilient for the future. And I think resilience is a thing that all businesses are thinking about now.
Okay, and Heather, what's the business view amongst your members? Is there any increase in interest? Do you think we can sustain the growth rates in the years to come?
It's not a conversation that I've had particularly around wages. The conversations I've had with my members have mostly been around mental well-being and health and well-being, which goes back to Sue's point of the, you know, the wraparound. I think that chamber businesses that we work with tend to be fairly civic-minded businesses anyway. That they do, the employers that I work with would, a lot of them have said, you know, we're still trying to make sure that our employees are getting paid, even if some of the directors aren't getting the same salaries or salaries from before. And because 98% of businesses in Wales are SMEs, these are smaller businesses tending to be working in a much smaller working environment. So, you know, employers and employees are quite close because we're all part of a smaller working ecosystem within each business. So I think that there is a really serious conversation to be had around, you know, what the affordability is for employers. And I know that the vast majority that I work with understand all the things that Sarah was talking about. You know, it's productivity, it's around feeling of inclusiveness, it's about understanding the value that you bring to the workplace. There's a whole range of other benefits, but in terms of the conversations I'm having at the moment, it's not coming up particularly. People are just talking to me about Brexit and about how they can just keep trading over the next few months, if I'm honest.
Absolutely. I mean, it's an extremely crowded agenda. We were looking at some statistics on business turnover the other day, and I mean, almost all businesses are reporting at least a modest decrease, some of them quite stark decreases. So we'll have to see how that goes. I think it was interesting that you both raised the points about pay being only part of the offer, if you like, part of the deal that's given to employers. And I wanted to ask Nisreen, I mean, is the living wage part of union objectives for workers, or what else is on the agenda for workers?
Yeah, I definitely think to some extent it is. And I think Dominic can talk a lot about how they've campaigned very successfully in a lot of sectors to introduce it. But I think it very much is viewed as the kind of the minimum goal for unions. And I think that where union campaigning differs, I think, from some of the other type of campaigns to improve the workplace is that we really get stuck into the detail of what it means. So when we look at social care, for instance, we're making good gains now in terms of we've got a social care forum in Wales for the first time, which is a good step towards sectoral bargaining for social care. And that will really have to encompass all the work that's happened in that sector around professionalisation, around skills, and also recognise there are lots of different jobs in that sector that deserve different levels of reward. And there's something really fundamental for us as well about that role of worker voice and being able to have a democratic say on what the broad sense of reward is that you get for the work that you do. So I think living wage is a great part of that sort of agenda for us, but it's much more kind of based in worker power for us.
Okay, Dominic, I mean, what's the agenda for public sector workers at the moment? Is it all about pay, or is it about more than that?
Well, it's certainly about pay for social care workers who, in the main, are subsisting on the basic minimum wage. And as Nisreen says, sometimes below that. We recently won a case with My Home Care, which led to thousands of pounds paid in back money because they actually breached the minimum wage legislation. So that is a key element for the low pay. But it is important, as has been described, the wraparound benefits, the sick leave, the annual leave. And there probably wouldn't have been a need for the Welsh Government to introduce an infection control fund if social care workers had access to proper sick pay and good terms and conditions. Because unfortunately, a lot of our members who are the frontline workers who are keeping these services going during this pandemic rely on statutory sick pay, which means that if you isolate yourself or if you have to quarantine yourself, you lose significant amounts of money. You have problems of feeding your family, of paying the rent. And so these are very key issues. But one of the areas I wanted to cover is the importance of procurement. And I think some of the social care providers will echo this, is that there needs to be proper funding for procurement. And the ethical procurement in the supply chain, which is a useful guidance document produced by Welsh Government, needs to be A, properly funded, but B, put on a statutory footing. And so that's the requirements, which include consideration of the real living wage, but also include trade union recognition, because we want to be able to bargain our way and represent our members out of low pay and poor terms and conditions. And it would be helpful if employers gave access to trade unions as well.
I mean, Sarah, you've been working with living wage employers. You also know that you've just heard, as well as knowing from workers themselves, it's not just about the money. I mean, what's the living wage campaign, living wage movement trying to do to address some of those concerns?
Sorry, was that for me?
Yes.
Yeah. Sorry. I think we would like to work even more collaboratively. So I think there's been good progress on that. Certainly within Cardiff now, we're working with the unions across sectors. I think it's important to recognise that and to communicate that the real living wage is part of the wider Fair Work agenda. Which is certainly how the First Minister sees it and how we view it as well. We know it's not the solution to a lot of the issues, but it is the kind of that first step. And I think the accreditation is that additional commitment in the long-term investment of the employers. So for us, I think it is putting it within that the wider Fair Work agenda and making sure we recognise that. And also understand and continue to do research on some of the other impacts that the living wage might have. For example, I know there was some concerns when research was conducted among living wage employers that employers might try and claw back the living wage and how it affected pay scales. So really understanding the impact that the living wage is having is really important. And then there's also other initiatives from the foundation, like the Living Hours Initiative, recognised service providers, living wage funders. So I think they're building up, these other voluntary commitments around this.
Okay. I mean, we've had nearly a decade of wages stagnating. We've also just been through, whether workers or businesses, an incredibly difficult 6 months or so, where the people at the bottom of the wage spectrum have actually been the ones who've borne the brunt of wage cuts. I mean, they've been less likely, if they've been furloughed, they've been less likely to get their pay top up. It's in terms of pay, in terms of many aspects of conditions, it's really quite a difficult story over the last few years, if not the last decade. I'm going to ask you all, are there any bright spots on the horizon in terms of how the labour market's looking? Who would like to go first?
So I'll start, if I may, because I think one of the things that I've seen, and I think our members are seeing, is that the consumer sort of view of businesses is changing. I think, you know, we've all, as I say, we've all seen the importance of NHS workers more than ever, and we should have known that anyway, but it's brought it home. You know, the supermarket workers who've kept working throughout, delivery people, all the key workers. And I think we are probably missing more than we thought things like treats going out to a restaurant, cinema trips, you know, the theatre, special occasions. So I think there'll be a switch in how people feel about some of those individuals who help us to do the things that we enjoy doing and actually just keep the country running. And I think that, you know, sentiment is going to translate into people expecting businesses to be more responsible, organisations to pay people properly and to have more respect and add more, you know, show the value of some of those jobs. So I think there is an opportunity here for us to, you know, we say build back better, build back responsibly. And I think people's personal experiences of this and the people around them is going to change how people feel about how people are paid.
I think that would be really nice to see, but I was quite shocked that just, you know, when Wales went into lockdown, there were reports that shop workers had been abused because people couldn't go and buy a hairdryer or a kettle or whatever. And I thought, gosh, what short memories people have got. So
Yeah.
I think the challenge is going to be making that early shift in attitude stick, really.
And I think it's a fair point, Victoria. And I think one of our members, Iceland Foods, actually, it was really interesting because in an early conversation with them in the first couple of weeks of lockdown, when everybody was, you know, crazy shopping, you know, back at the beginning of the year, their view of that was, even though it was awful, some of the incidents that happened there, that their view was that some of those individuals weren't best equipped to deal with that situation, and they were panicking and almost they were forgiving of how people had behaved, which I think is a really interesting view to take. But I think, you know, that there's something here about turning this into a positive, and I do think that consumers will be more careful about how they spend their money in future, and are likely to spend that with organisations that they can see have behaved responsibly during this very difficult time, and are, you know, behaving responsibly in the future.
And presumably then tick marks like being a living wage employer, like being a member of business in the community, then help to distinguish those businesses from the mass. Yeah. Dominic, do you see any bright spots on the horizon?
Well, I do share Sue's optimism about the shift in perception of the key workers, and the issue for us is how that we then harvest that goodwill, and just taking this to a different level, that a more macro level, there needs to be a paradigm shift in economic thinking away from austerity. And the danger is, and we've had an indication because university staff have been offered a 0% pay rise for next year. We've already got an indication that working people will again be paying the price for this pandemic. And but it was austerity, 15 years of austerity, that hollowed out public services, that took away any slack that we had in the system, which meant that the UK and unfortunately also the Welsh government's handling of this pandemic has caused unnecessary levels of death and unnecessary levels of contraction of this virus. And so, yes, you do hope that there'll be change, but it does require very serious economic change. It does require redistribution of wealth. It does, because unfortunately we've seen billionaires increase their wealth by dramatic amounts during this pandemic. We've seen some companies, large companies, the Tesco's of this world, making big profits out of this as well. There needs to be a proper redistribution of wealth in order to properly provide for the public services and the essential key workers that keep our communities going.
I'm struggling to see quite the where you see the bright spots in that, but
the paradigm shift. This is an opportunity for a paradigm shift, and Sue is right. I think public perception of key workers has changed, but we need the political will. And I can come on later about where I see the living wage moving from and how the living wage can be part of that paradigm shift.
Heather, how do you see what bright spots do you see?
I think it's interesting. No, I think it's interesting. There is a there is a need for a paradigm shift, but probably my perspective on that is probably different to Dominic's. You know, I have seen through the pandemic the conversation that business leaders have had with governments has been a much more candid and frequent conversation that we have had, which does give us the opportunity through the pandemic to influence government decisions in a much more holistic and a much more reactive way than I think we had before. And the impact for me there is that the paradigm shift perhaps is that we need to be looking at government policies that support businesses and help them in terms of the way that takes away some of the other controls on businesses, that does enable them then to make decisions to support living wages and paying differently, because it will help businesses work the different margins that they're working to. So I think one of the conversations that we're having much more, and we talked about SSP earlier on, that's absolutely vital, because having central government and local decisions based around how people get paid in those situations affects their behaviour. And that's what we're talking about here. You know, it's the ability for people to make the right decisions, whether they're employers or employees, but around ways of helping businesses to keep going. Which is perhaps my wider perspective, which is we need a much more candid conversation. The whole thing around the job retention scheme last week being a case in point, that has potentially created a lot of unnecessary redundancies just because we didn't get some joined up policy thinking from the government. So it applies to a whole range of things that affect businesses, and the living wages being part of that. But it has to be seen as part of a bigger suite of work that employers need to kind of cover off as they're navigating their way through the range of regulations and situations that they find themselves in.
I mean, it seems to me that the risk is that if the labour market gets considerably worse, which it could well do, because with not just coronavirus but Brexit on the horizon as well, I mean, there may well be a tendency to rush to the bottom, partly for business survival, but partly because unethical businesses can, because there's so many people looking for work. So I think that the challenge is going to be to try and hang on to those sort of standards that you've just talked about. I mean, Nisreen, can you see any bright spots from where you are in Wales 2C?
I've got a very modest bright spot. It's very contextual. So I think what's happened as part of this pandemic is that Welsh Government are now in contact and able to influence so many more businesses than they were before. And we've really got to kind of capture that now for the benefit of the workforce. And I think something you asked earlier about, well, what beyond pay is a worker priority, not just at a workplace level, but in our kind of wider political lobbying work, job security is absolutely critical. Job retention as well, now we're in crisis, but security. So introducing more worker-focused conditionality on any public money that's going out, linked to procurement as well, but the grant funding seems absolutely key for that. So making sure that jobs are retained, and that where there are jobs or where workers are being taken on, that they're taken on in a secure way, could really start to make a difference. Because even before this crisis, I think around 1 in 10 people were in some form of precarious work. So building back better has to be done from a worker focused angle. And the other thing is health and safety has had a bit more of a sort of popular reputation over the last couple of months, because it was really, really unfashionable. And I think the pandemic's obviously shone a light on how important workplace health and safety is, but it's also made Welsh Government consider what influence can we have in this area, even though most of it isn't devolved, and how can we bring together the right agencies and unions and employers to make our work in that area a little bit more strategic. And I think over the long term that could have a really positive effect too.
I mean, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think one of the most interesting and potentially fruitful areas that's emerged is the way in which the Welsh Government has used its powers around health and around aspects of business to try and shape what some might see as non-devolved issues. And I think that we haven't seen that before, and I think that's very interesting. And it's if I was to have a bright spot, I think that's what I would see. But I'm here to listen rather than to answer my own questions. Sarah, did you want to add to the bright spots? Do you see any?
Yeah, I do. And picking up on Nisreen, you know, I think we've got to remember in Wales in particular, we have the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act and the goal of a more equal Wales, and also a current government anyway, who has good, you know, good relationships with trade unions. And I think that, you know, there are these mechanisms like the economic contract, the code of practice on ethical procurement that are there, and that I agree with Dominic need to be strengthened. And I know that there's works going on at that at the moment. From an accreditation point of view, another real positive is the status that Cardiff received last year as a living wage city. And this was really as a result of the local authority, Citizens UK, and the private sector working together. And as a result of that, there's been the percentage of living wage accredited employers in Cardiff is about 46% of the Welsh total. Now, what's good about that is that the WLGA have just accredited in the last few days, and we're seeing a lot more interest from other local authorities. And when other local authorities start to accredit, you know, as anchor institutions in their area, they're in a really good position to lead and also provide financial support to businesses in the local area with accreditation, and also promote the real living wage. So I think, you know, that accreditation of the WLGA, the local authority interest we're seeing in creating living wage places, and also their support for the social care campaign, you know, getting them on board. Those are some of the bright spots, I would say.
I think the challenge, I mean, Cardiff, it has done incredibly well, both in getting the accreditation and in spreading the word. The challenge is going to be rolling that out across Wales, because there are still living wage deserts in many places in Wales where, you know, there just aren't the number of employers. You don't have that critical mass, if you like, in order to raise the profile.
Yeah, and I think that's where the living wage places, and we're holding a session on Thursday with local authorities on this to really understand the process of creating a living wage place, and how it can support an uplift in accreditations in the local area. So I hope now we'll start to see more interest. And
okay, watch this space then.
Yeah, hopefully. Well, we'll try our best.
The last question that I wanted to put to you was, we've seen the living wage movement take off in Wales in a way that it hadn't done previously. And one of the things that we learnt from Scotland when we were doing some work on the living wage a few years ago was that the strength of the living wage movement was in creating a movement in parallel with trade union movement and alongside employers that generated that groundswell of opinion. And it's a moot point whether we've done that yet in Wales, but perhaps we can think, what can we learn? Is anything we can learn about the way that the living wage has taken off in Wales, and perhaps has or maybe has not captured public imagination? Who would like to go first on that?
Yeah, I'm happy to give it this a shot, because I think certainly the presenting of a balanced win-win argument around the foundation living wage is a key way of winning hearts and minds, not only of business but of politicians, and it's the alliance that can be created between politicians and business and the community at large, which is the driving force for this foundation living wage, and it's the potential to move this foundation living wage much more forward, so it actually does challenge the current economic assumptions, which unfortunately are still based in the ideas, the ill-founded ideas of housekeeping bills and how you need to balance the budgets. But I think this pandemic has demonstrated that money, when it is necessary for the survival of this nation, can be found, and the issue is how you deploy it and when you deploy it. And it would be useful if the UK stops comparing itself with other European countries who have responded as badly as we have to this pandemic, and start comparing ourselves to the Chinas and the Japanese systems of dealing with this pandemic, which has demonstrated that the public services properly funded and properly resourced, can keep this pandemic under control. If you look at the difference in scale, a city of 11 million in China tested for coronavirus over a 5-day period. And we are only now getting our capacity up to dealing with testing on a city level, and we're not doing it in the most constructive manner either.
Okay, so what can we learn from the living wage movement, Sue?
So I think there's something here about, setting a standard based on evidence. So, saying to people, this is the standard that people should be working to, getting some, sometimes, either recognised organisations, the government itself, etc., to commit to that you get good evidence about all the benefits of doing that, why it's the right thing to do, because businesses need evidence, they need hard facts. There's one thing about it being the right thing to do, but it needs to make business sense. This is kind of fits with where I was saying earlier about maybe also looking at business models. And then I think you need to share stories. You need businesses to speak to other businesses. If you're trying to convince the local authorities, you need local authorities to speak to local authorities so that they can hear from people who are in situations like them about why it was the right thing to do and why it works. So yeah, I think setting that standard, getting people to lead the way, and then telling people why it's the right thing to do.
So it's almost that moral argument and emotional appeal alongside the rationale. It can perhaps reach places that other methods can't reach, maybe. Is the sort of Heineken effect, if that's what you're saying, Sue?
Yes, yeah.
What about you, Heather? I mean, how do you see the living wage movement? Can we learn anything from it in terms of improving conditions at work?
I mean, absolutely, yes. I think the bit that's missing for a lot of employers at the moment is just exactly what Sue said. There's a lot of employers that want to do the right thing, but that business argument, the business case for the living wage, I think is missing a lot of the time at the moment. It's not hitting those smaller businesses. Understanding how that makes good business sense from a whole range of other things that have come to the business. That's not necessarily been the language that I think a lot of them have been hearing. Yes, it's seen to be because it's the right thing to do, but actually it has to make sound business sense. So there's a communication gap for me around this at the moment, and if we're to start to influence employers to behave differently, we have to talk the language of employers so they understand how that actually works for them in a business setting. And looking at how others have done that is clearly something that we can do. There's also an issue here for me about the very many Welsh employers along the border as well. The conversations we've had around Fair Work to make sure that employers in Wales understand how the whole idea of Fair Work is linked across the internal market, so that Wales understands how there's an advantage there, and not, a fact that we could attract better talent, for example, because we're paying better wages, but also the potential cost impact on that to running a business. So there's a few areas that I think need some quite mature conversation from a business perspective as to how we actually take this forward to capture more employers into the mix in making these decisions.
I think there's been a tendency, an understandable tendency perhaps, for some of the early sign-ups to accreditation were, if you like, the low-hanging fruit. They were organisations for which it was relatively easy to get accreditation because the scale of the uplift for their employees was relatively modest. Whereas we have whole sectors of the economy that are based on relatively low pay, very low pay sometimes, and also not particularly good conditions. I won't name names, but we all know which they are. And I think the challenge is going to be, as you rightly said, Heather, is working out how those employers can move from a low wage model, as you said, Sue, into something that's different, that's based on higher wages and better conditions, and yet still delivers the shops, the restaurants, the hotels, etc., that consumers still want. So yeah, Nisreen, I mean, what do you think the union movement can learn anything from the living wage movement? Are you allowed to say?
I think I agree with Sue a bit in terms of it's that wider kind of moral outrage about low pay that we need to, you know, jump on and work with, because I think, you know, we see things often quite narrowly through a worker-employer relationship, but this shows that there is far much more concern out there for what's happening in for lower paid people. But I think the best way to introduce the living wage is where you've got workplace democracy. So, you know, it's not just the employer's decision, but the workers are asking for it and voting on it too. And so I think perhaps as the movement moves forward, there can be more of a way of seeing the living wage as a kind of gateway to unionisation and workplace democracy. I think that would be really exciting. I think if an employer is willing to accept that they should be paying this better minimum wage, perhaps they can also recognise that their workers should be organised and focus on a whole range of other things in the workplace. That'd be really exciting.
Good. And Sarah, what do you think? I mean, you've been involved in Canal Cymru for 6 months, 9 months?
Yeah, January.
Since January, okay, so 11 months then.
Yeah, exactly. I'm an expert now.
How do you, I mean, what do you think are the lessons that not only that you have learned, but that we can all learn from the experience of living wage?
Yeah, so I've really seen something that Sue mentioned, the support, that peer support, and, you know, organisations, for example, universities are a good example of this, like with the university supporting each other with some of the challenges of accreditation. And this can also translate to other areas, for example, like other areas of fair work, the climate crisis that we have at the moment. So I've really seen that, you know, building those support networks, that's worked really well in terms of the living wage. I also think, I mean, when we think about how the living wage started, it was a movement of citizens. It's a voluntary initiative. It's a form of civil regulation, and it's shown that this voluntary movement, you know, can provide a sustainable, long-term solution to the problem of low pay. And that really came from listening to the key problems of workers in East London. So I think there's something else, you know, what Nisreen was saying, using the living wage, but also as a gateway to other things, to building that discussion with workers. You know, I think that we can learn a lot from that as well. So yeah, those are some of the things that I think I've learned.
Okay, I mean, I've always seen the living wage campaign as being very, very effective at making the moral case. And also making what a lot of people might see as a discussion that you don't want to have, which is about pay rates. It actually makes it quite fun and use lots of attractive graphics and stories. But I think, as Heather said, sometimes the business case, the real nuts and bolts in terms of what you know, the business bottom line is perhaps not as persuasive as it could be. So that as it goes forward, I think it's going to get really, really tough. Well,
I think that part of the comment on the communication gap, I agree. I think at the moment the research is quite academic, and needs to be translated more into business language, particularly for SMEs. We've heard, you know, in the last few weeks that it is really difficult to, you know, to sell the benefits of the real living wage, particularly at the moment, in context of, you know, better relations, etc. So I think there's definitely more work that we need to do there, you know, with the foundation on that. So it was really good to hear that again today, because it's also reminded me to prioritise that.
Okay, so there we have it. We've got the real living wage announced at £9.50 an hour today. We've got a growing number of businesses agreeing to pay it. I think we've all agreed that it's going to be challenging to increase both the take-up in terms of businesses, but also to make sure more workers benefit in the current economic climate. But I think we also all agree that this is something that should be done, not just in terms of pay, but in terms of a whole package of decent and fair work for employees. We've got different methods. We've got worker voice. We've got citizen power. We've got businesses feeling a sense of responsibility, and also the ever-present business bottom line. But I think teased out, and I hope we've all agreed that the living wage, the real living wage, has got a lot to offer Welsh people and Welsh businesses. So unless anyone's got anything more to add, I'll thank you all very much and say goodbye.